Welcome to Off the Shelf with Christine and Katie, where we share with you our recommendations for books to help you find your next read or to help build your to-be-read list for the future. This month, we are going to look at some of our favorite or are currently reading thriller, horror, and suspense books. Later on, we're going to be hearing from our coworker, Ebony, who is an aficionado of these genres. She is our go-to person in the library when it comes to recommending books that'll help keep you on the edge of your seat and maybe give you even a little bit of a scare. And she'll be sharing with us her top horror picks. But before we get started with that, we thought it might be helpful to kind of give you a little bit of a definition on the genres. You know, what's a suspense, what's a horror, what's a thriller? Katie's gonna give you some input on that.
All right, so let's go. So the suspense genre is stories that create excitement with an unpredictable mystery that keeps readers on the edge of their seats, waiting anxiously to see what happens next. While suspense is a genre on its own, elements of suspense can be found in different areas. And thrillers are dark, engrossing stories where the protagonist is in danger from the onset. These stories are intended to create a feeling of suspense and sometimes fear. The level of terror sometimes makes thriller stories border on horror. They have many subgenres such as psychological, political, criminal, mystery, science fiction, and many more. And horror stories are meant to evoke fear, fascination, or revulsion in readers, either through supernatural elements or psychological circumstances. Stephen King is big on this. And there are creatures, normally such as werewolves, zombies, ghosts, vampires, monsters, and people considered crazy, bent on harming others, are common in horror stories. These stories usually contain higher rates of death and violence, more than some other genres.
Okay. The horror stories do get to me. I think my favorite's thrillers, but yeah, I'm going to go through with you guys. So,
well, you know, I'm not a big horror fan either, but there are some stories that I have enjoyed.
I would say my number one horror pick, you mentioned Stephen King, and my book for my favorite horror book is called Night Shift. Now, Night Shift is a book by Stephen King, who we've all considered the master of the thriller horror genre.
Yes.
I first read this collection of short stories when I was a teenager, and they still scare me to this day when I read them.
Ooh.
You know, I can read them over. After reading this book, it was a while before I would feel brave enough to try another horror book. These are the kind of stories that stick with you, and he's kind of known for that. Some of the selections in this book are Jerusalem's Lot, which is the precursor to Salem's Lot. Sometimes they come back. Oh, that one. Yeah, that was also made into a movie, which wasn't as good as
I was going to say, I don't think I've ever heard of Jerusalem's Lot before.
It's the backstory to Salem's Lot, and the bit about the rats in the walls, not really being rats in the walls, scared me every time. Yeah, when I heard a scratch in my house, like on the roof, the squirrels running up on the roof, I was like, oh, I hope it's not the vampires.
Yes. Well, speaking of Stephen King, I actually took many years to even get used to seeing clowns again in a regular context.
Also, Children of the Corn, the book is, the story is in this book. And the other one that really got to me was called I Am the Doorway, about an astronaut. He comes back. He's actually inhabited by an alien. But the thing, one of the covers of this book has a hand, and in each of the folds, there's an eye. And that's from that book. And that's
that's so creepy.
Kind of very creepy.
Yeah.
Currently, I am reading Survive the Night by Riley Sager, which is a thriller. We had him here as an author, talk. Hopefully some of you got to see him, because this is a really good book. If you kind of flash back to 1980s, this is a time when there were no cell phones. We got a serial campus killer running loose, and we have a college student who is so desperate to get home, she takes a ride from a stranger, from the ride board, which is something we used to do back then.
I never heard of the ride board, so that was new for me.
It's not a thing now. And she's traveling through the night to get home, and this stranger feels like he's hiding something. Ooh. And there you go. That's the setting for this book, and it's kind of a little creepy. Keeps you on the edge. I have trouble putting it down when I don't have time to finish reading it. Now, my next attempt at horror is To Be Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. He's originally known for writing Perks of Being a Wallflower. In fact, that is his only other book, and it took him 20 years to come out with this adult horror book. I first attempted to read it when it first came out. I started it late at night, which is not something you should do when you're reading a horror book. I had to put it away.
No.
Then I turned around and said, okay, I'll listen to it. Again, I started it at night. Not a good thing.
Did it take you 20 years to finish?
I have not finished it. I'm getting ready to try attempt
But it's one of
number
your
3.
favorite horrors?
No,
Because you can't finish it.
It's my to be read.
Oh, it's your to be read.
I intend to finish it this Halloween season.
Okay.
It's about a young boy. He disappears in the woods. He's gone for a few days and he comes back and he's hearing voices in his head that are giving him a mission that only he can complete. And the thing about these woods is that years previously, another young boy disappeared, but he never came back.
Dun, dun, dun.
And that's where your supernatural element comes in. And, that's where the whole hearing these voices and the suspense and the horror comes in. I can't wait to actually read this. So
I'm noticing with a lot of these like teen writers that they also seem to delve into horror, because I didn't know Roald Dahl also wrote horror until many years later. Actually, when I first worked at libraries, I found out he actually wrote a horror collection.
They write wonderful horror stories, and I don't know why, if it has something to do about the young adult authors, the way they write their stories. But yeah, I've noticed the same thing too. And they write really good
that's interesting
stories. Those are my 3, my fave, my current, my soon to be read. But now Katie wants to share with us some of her favorite horror books, one of which is also a favorite of mine. So why don't you take it away?
Alrighty, so the one I want to recommend is Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. This is actually her debut novel. We all know her now as the Vampire Girl, but before then this was just her first novel. And just for a brief description, it's in the late 20th century. A vampire named Louis Dupont tells his life to a young interviewer in San Francisco. He is a plantation owner and he is distraught over the death of his 25-year-old brother. And he blames himself, and Lestat, the vampire, comes along and offers to turn him into a vampire to live forever. And that is, I don't want to ruin it further than there, but then Louis allows himself to be changed into a vampire and immediately sees all the beauty and wonder of his former human life. I really love this novel. It's been made into a lovely movie that was in the 90s, and I hear there's a new adaptation coming out. It is a really good story, and I highly recommend. I don't want to spoil it too much because a lot happens to the character, but it's really good. And for Anne Rice's first novel, I thought it was a really good attempt at getting to know that lore, and she did do a lot of core vampire lore that we know today. Exactly. So we got that from her,
which I really appreciated, because she stuck to the true lore of a vampire. She had a couple of little twists and things in there, but for the main part, she kept with things we know vampires to be. They are walking corpses. They sleep during the day. They drink blood. All these different things that we love in our vampires. And I absolutely love this whole series.
Yes, I highly recommend it.
I think the Vampire Lestat, which is the second book in the series, I liked more than this, but you have to start somewhere.
Yes, you should start with this one. Lestat does take it in a different direction. There was also a movie about it, but I don't recommend it because it wasn't very good, but they did try. It was in that same 90s era where they were still figuring it out, but Interview with the Vampire did do better. But if you are interested, the movie Lestat is out there, but it's just not very good. But the book is way better. I agree. But I always try to say go with the first one.
You have to.
Yes.
Otherwise
you won't know what's going on.
You miss some of the references that are in the later books if you do not read the first one. So I highly recommend the entire series. I loved it.
I'm glad, but yeah, it's a classic vampire lore. Vampires is more my speed, so. All right. And the next one I want to recommend is House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski. And this book is kind of hard to explain, but I'm going to try. The plot is centered on a possibly fictional documentary about a family whose house is impossibly larger on the inside than the outside. And, and the format and structure of this book is pretty unconventional, with this unusual page layout and style, making a prime example of what we call pathway literature. I didn't know this until I read this book, by the way, and it contains numerous footnotes, most of which have footnotes themselves. So you have to pay a lot of attention to this book, but it still keeps you very intrigued. And it has references to other fictional books, movies, or articles. And in some of the pages, it only contains a few words of text arranged in strange ways to mirror the events in the story. And it creates like an agoraphobic or claustrophobic feeling. And I've read this book twice and I've gotten like different things out of it each time. The first time I read it, I interpreted it as a horror story about how your own home can be personally terrifying. And the second time I read it, I thought the main story was actually about the narrator, who we follow in the book, and about how he was slowly going insane and his obsession with the family that used to live in the house that the main narrative is about. So what I really like about this book is it's so different. It keeps you unique. The pages are so interesting. I'm going to show one later. But I normally don't like horror stories, but this has to be my favorite because it just has a unique thing to you each time. So I highly recommend it just for its oddness, and it always keeps you intrigued.
You mentioned about the horror in your own house. So if I couple that with Jerusalem's Lot and the scratching inside, I can be like not going anywhere for days.
Yes, and just
not going into my house.
And to just show an example page, it'll just have like little words of text on it, and then it goes from that to having like blocks like cut out, and it looks like half of it looks like a film script and half of it looks like just a regular book. Every page, and one page is entirely, I don't know which one it is, but is entirely devoted to a spiral center, so you have to keep reading like that. So it does keep you on your toes. But like I said, I've read this book twice, and every time I read it, I get something new out of it. It's hard. Some people have actually called it a love story. Like someone in the interview went up to the author and said, I think this is a love story. So some people view it as horror, some people view it as a love story. It's really up to you. But that's what's so good about this book is it's kind of like almost, I wouldn't say choose your own adventure, but you get different things out of it.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah. Oh, and the next one I want to recommend is going back to my vampire book loves. Is called Let the Right One In by John Avid Levinsk. I'm positive I'm butchering that name, so I apologize. But it is a story that centers on a relationship between a 12-year-old boy, Oscar, and a centuries-old vampire named Eli. And it takes place in Blackburg, which is it's a working class outside of Stockholm in the early 1990s. The book centers on their friendship without giving too much away. It is a sweet but darkly charming tale. I don't want to ruin it because it's just so good. But whether you read the book or whether actually watch both movie adaptations, because there's one Swedish and one American, they're both so good. There's just very few differences, but both are actually very faithful to the book. So you can't really go wrong with whichever version you decide to either read or watch, because they're both very good. And my last pick is actually, I'm not known for recommending Stephen King, but I will recommend his The Green Mile book. So The Green Mile is about a story about a death row supervisor, Paul Edgecombe's encounter with John Coffey, an unusual inmate who was displaying inexplicable healing and empathic abilities. It was a very intriguing book. It had a lot of differing elements that I never thought Stephen King would really write about before. It has almost like a Christian godly element to it. And John Coffey is such a unique, like heartwarming character that you just feel so bad for his situation. And in the movie, he's played by Michael Clark Duncan, who's unfortunately he's not around anymore, and he just played him so well. So I highly recommend the book. I highly recommend the movie. It's very good. I don't want to give much away, but it's very interesting. And normally I would not usually recommend Stephen King because sometimes for me he falls flat, but in this one he did such a good job at writing this character.
This is more of like psychological horror as opposed to those supernatural beings.
Yes, it was kind of both. It was about like supernatural and like a supreme being. It was so very interesting, and it really kept me intrigued. So I had to recommend it for this.
I did watch the movie. I really enjoyed the movie. So now I'm definitely gonna have to take a gander into the books. At least it won't, maybe scare me
as much.
But
well, it's not as bad as some of his others. It's definitely more of like a supernatural thing, but it doesn't go too outlandish with it.
I do like vampire stories too. Those are one of those things that like you mentioned that you love vampire stories. I do. For some reason I can enjoy those horror stories and not get too scared because they're not real. I guess.
Right.
But, you know, still late at night, you get those creeps, they crawl in, you know.
I agree. You know, for me, horror is truly scary when it's based on reality. That's why I think it took me a long time to get over it, because clowns are a real thing.
Yeah.
So that took me a long time to heal from.
Yeah.
So that's why I think when it comes to vampires and like angels, I'm like, okay, that's nothing that I see in my reality. So I can kind of, you know, scoot past that. But yeah.
And now we're just going to hear a little bit from Ebony on
Yes.
what her favorite picks are for horror.
Hey everyone, my name is Ebony, and today I wanted to talk about a few horror recommendations for the month of October. I'm a huge horror fan, so I wanted to recommend some lesser known titles that might be new to you and that you can pick up at our library this month. The first book that I'm recommending is Tender is the Flesh by Agustina Basterrica, an Argentinian author. This book is translated from the Spanish by Sarah Moses. It's a horror dystopian novel. So in the beginning, we learn that there is a virus that has infected animal meat, and consuming animals has become poisonous to humans. As part of the transition, the government has sanctioned the processing of human meat by breeding and factory farming humans. So we follow Marcus, who is a worker at one of the processing plants. It's a pretty grim book, as you can imagine, but also very interesting and fascinating at the same time. But obviously not for the squeamish at heart. The next book that I wanted to talk about is 20 Days of Turin by Giorgio Di Maria. It's translated from the Spanish by Ramon Glazov. 20 Days of Turin follows the events of a town in Italy where a library collects the personal diaries of other citizens and then allows others to read them. And there's a malicious entity who feeds on the citizens, and for 20 days there's a massacre happening every night, and even those who witness those events cannot explain them. The library soon disappears, and eventually a man comes forward to try to investigate and discover what happened during those 20 days and why no one in turn wants to talk about it. So the next book that I wanted to talk about is Uzumaki by Junji Ito. It is a manga translated from the Japanese by Yuji Oniki. Uzumaki is a horror manga that follows a young man as he witnesses his town being consumed by an evil entity. The premise is pretty basic, but the imagery and horror that Junji translates to the page is pretty phenomenal. I highly recommend it. The next book that I'm recommending is The Troop by Nick Cutter. This is one of my all-time favorite horror books. If you're looking for a more visceral reaction from a horror book, one that will literally give you the creeps while you're reading it, then this is the one. The book follows a Boy Scout troop on an island in Canada where they are approached by a sickly-looking man who carries a horrifying and deadly parasite. It's been released and it's made its way to this island, and now the boys and their troop leader have to figure out how to survive a killer that literally lives right under their skin. I will say that this book has a really difficult and horrible scenes of animal abuse and animal testing, so if that's something that affects you strongly, this might not be the read for you. So the last book that I'm going to recommend is The Murders of Molly Softborn by Tade Thompson. It's a short novella-length book about a young woman who creates clones of herself every time she bleeds. The only thing is that each of these clones is trying to kill her at the same time. So this is a great read if you're looking for something just quick and entertaining. So I also want to talk about an upcoming new release that I've been wanting to read and hope to read during the month of October. The book is less horror and more of a thriller, but the premise sounds intriguing. So this book is Never Saw Me Coming by Vera Kurian. And the book follows a college freshman named Chloe Sever, who is part of an unusual group of students participating in a clinical study on campus. All of the students have one thing in common: they're all psychopaths. In this study, they are required to wear watches and monitor their movements and mood. When a student is murdered, Chloe finds herself wondering if she can trust her fellow psychopaths and not become prey herself. She's also in the middle of plotting to murder someone herself, so exciting and very interested to read this one. So those are my horror recommendations for the month. If you do happen to read any of them and like them, come in and let us know. And I hope you have a good month and happy reading.
Right.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Ebony.
Ebony. That was great. So those were our picks for your Spooktober.
Exactly.
Enjoy. Hopefully you'll get a little bit of a scare on. And if you need another recommendations, please feel free to visit our book recommendations page on the MTPL website. We'll have a link to it below this video. We have a virtual bookshelf there
Yes.
that has more picks given to me by Ebony. And We also have a link to the book recommendation form, where if none of these books are to your liking, you have a different type of scare you'd like, or you just don't want a scare, you want something else to read this month,
Feel free to reach out to us.
fill it
And
out. We'll get back to you. Yeah.
yes.
All right. Have a great one.
Alrighty.
See you next
Happy
month.
October and happy Halloween.
Halloween.
Bye.